Okay, we'll start with this. An update as to what the former undisputed welterweight champion Cecilia Brækhus has planned for the near and immediate future. She appears to be planning a move upstairs to junior middleweight, which we talked about here on the channel.
We did.
And per sophisticated apparatuses.
Calm down, Sherlock. You used Google Translate.
We're able to translate a Norwegian article that maps out what the immediate future might hold for Cecilia. Earlier this year, Betsson was able to tell that Cecilia Brækhus continues her career in the weight class at super welterweight. In a press release, Betsson now reveals who will be the first opponent in her new weight class. This is something I've long been really looking forward to being able to tell, grins a radiantly happy Cecilia Brækhus before she continues. After long negotiations and a lot of back and forth, it is finally clear that I will go to a World Cup match on August 13th. I meet Patricia Bergoult for the title race at WBC in Cali, Colombia.
This would be Cecilia Brækhus' first fight since losing 2 back-to-back decisions to Jessica McCaskill.
And Patricia Bergoult's first fight since having become this division's WBC champion. This would be Patricia's first defense as a reigning champion. Cecilia added, "The fact that I'm jumping straight into a new world title match in a new weight class makes me super motivated. I was the first woman to become an undisputed champion in the 4-belt era. Being able to become world champion in 2 weight classes is probably the closest thing that can match that achievement and is something I strongly want to be able to do," says Brækhus, who is looking forward to potentially being able to call herself the world's best.
We'll see. There are 4 active reigning world champions in today's junior middleweight division.
Patricia Bergoult among them, the Swedish champion holding the green belt, the WBC title, Natasha Jonas of Great Britain holding the WBO, Hannah Rankin of Scotland holding the WBA, and Canadia's own Marie-Eve Dicaire holding the IBF, the blue belt.
4 world champions at 154 pounds.
Cecilia Brækhus aspires to be one among them. The landscape at junior middleweight has effectively changed. We talked about this here on the channel, how after Claressa Shields became this division's undisputed champion, there really wouldn't be much reason for her to stay there. The only cash fight at or around these weights for Claressa would have to be north of junior middleweight at middleweight with her old buddy, Savannah Marshall. So she moved back upstairs, and now
the reset button has been hit.
What do I think about this fight? I think it's ambitious of Cecilia Brækhus to aspire to become a 2-division champion at this age. Make no mistake, Cecilia Brækhus is one of the most accomplished active women boxers in the sport of women's boxing, but she's no spring chicken.
She's 12 years older than her opponent.
She's a very lively 40 years old to Patricia Bergoult, the reigning champion, who's very spry, 28 years old. Cecilia is a lot more experienced than Patricia, but Patricia has youth and size on her side.
She's fought in the last 12 months. Cecilia hasn't.
She was last in action late last year in November against Olivia Belkacem. She won a unanimous decision. Before that, she hadn't seen action since 2019. A victory over Scotland's own Hannah Rankin that is aging well, as Hannah is now a champion at this weight.
Before she became a champion, Patricia beat her back in 2019 and won a decision.
Whereas Cecilia, she hasn't seen action since March of last year. In that way, it's been approximately 12 months since she had a fight, and it was her second decision loss to Jessica McCaskill, who still reigns here today as the welterweight division's undisputed champion. Cecilia hasn't fought in the last 12 months. Don't really like the sound of that, though. Perhaps the time away might have been beneficial. We'll just have to wait and see. She will have home field advantage here against Patricia Bergoult. The fight's going down in Cecilia Brækhus' native Colombia. For those not aware, Cecilia Brækhus is a Norwegian national, but her place of birth was in fact Colombia.
She achieved a lot of success, a lot of notoriety as a Norwegian fighter.
A Norwegian national, easily becoming one of the most recognizable faces in Norwegian sport, male or female. But this is a return home for Cecilia Brækhus. This fight set to go down mid-August towards the end of the summer in her native Colombia. Patricia Bergoult people must be very confident that they can hang on to the green belt, that they'd be willing to take on Cecilia Brækhus in Cecilia's neck of the woods, where she has home field advantage.
Seems that Jonathan Banks is back in her corner.
Nothing against Abel Sanchez and his brief stint as Cecilia Brækhus' trainer, but I didn't like how she looked under his watchful eye, under his tutelage. No.
Nope.
Cecilia's not an offensively minded fighter.
Her bread and butter has always been a boxing.
A boxer, not brute force. Cecilia Brækhus characteristically has always been a cerebral fighter, and I don't think Abel Sanchez was the best choice for her. That brief stint they had, I didn't like how she looked under that guy. It's actually encouraging that she's got Jonathan Banks back in her corner, because I don't imagine that a fight with Patricia Bergult is going to be easy.
The name of the game can't be out-muscling Patricia Bergult.
She's naturally bigger than Cecilia, perhaps physically stronger. The best bet is to outwit her.
Outthink her.
Outfox and thereby outbox her, and I happen to think that Jonathan Banks can help Cecilia do that a lot better than Abel Sanchez can, so that is encouraging.
We'll talk more about this fight as the fight date approaches.
Brækhus versus Bergult for the WBC junior middleweight title set to go down late summer in August. In other news, the PBC's Tom Brown stated, "We offered Canelo $45 million for Charlo, $55 million for Spence at 164 pounds, or Benavidez at 168.
Go figure, it's Canelo's fight week and Tom Brown wants to make it about him.
PBC, as it were, they want to make it about them. A portion of the article reads, "What hasn't been revealed until now is that the exact offer from Al Heyman's PBC and Showtime that Alvarez turned down to accept DAZN's deal included the option of a pay-per-view fight against undefeated welterweight champion Errol Spence Jr. Tom Brown, whose company, TGB Promotions, represents Spence and Jermall Charlo, informed BoxingScene.com that the PBC offered Alvarez $45 million guarantee to fight Jermall Charlo on a Saturday night if he would have conquered Charlo, a $55 million guarantee to either
Spence at a catch weight of 164 pounds
or David Benavidez at 168 pounds.
Can you believe that these guys are still sulking?
Still sulking after all this time. Still shading Canelo Alvarez, and rest assured that's what they're doing.
They're shading Canelo Alvarez for deciding to fight Dimitri Bivol instead of those guys.
His fights against Charlo and Spence or Benavidez all would have been contested for Alvarez's IBF, WBA, WBC, and WBO super middleweight titles. Golovkin, the IBF and WBA middleweight champion, also would move up from the 160-pound division to challenge Alvarez for his 168-pound crowns if Alvarez beats Bivol.
Yeah, what you're not saying is that Gennadi's a bigger name than any of those guys.
Yeah, Spence would have had to move up, and so would have Jermall had Canelo Alvarez decided to take their deal instead of DAZN's. But the difference is Gennady is a bigger name than Errol Spence Jr., a bigger name than Jermall Charlo.
Even now at 40 years old.
He's a bigger name than Errol Spence Jr., a bigger name than Jermall Charlo, a bigger name than David Benavidez. For Christ's sakes, the best they could do for David Benavidez is get him a guy that Gennady beat years ago.
You can't poo-poo all over Canelo picking him when he's a bigger name than those guys.
You fucking know it. Alvarez's combined compensation for the Bivol and Golovkin fights is believed to be comparable to what his guarantees would have totaled for fighting Charlo and Spence or Benavidez. Brown believes that Eddie Reynoso, who manages and trains Alvarez, encouraged the four-division champion to take a path of lesser resistance versus Russia's Bivol and Kazakhstan's Golovkin, who turned 40 last month.
You see if I understand this. You think taking on an unbeaten light heavyweight champion in his prime is the path of least resistance?
Fighting a welterweight moving up to super middleweight is not.
What, I'm supposed to believe Spence gives Canelo a harder time than Bivol?
You're supposed to believe Jermall Charlo gives Canelo a harder time than Bivol. What is that based on? Props to Eddie Reynoso, the manager of the year, for getting Canelo these huge paydays with the least risk, Brown said. He had him take the least risk for the most reward because he had a chance to fight a reigning world champion at 160 pounds in Charlo, and he also had the chance to fight an undefeated two-time former 168-pound champion in Benavidez. Or he could have fought the reigning welterweight champion.
Let me see if I understand this. You think Canelo fighting a naturally bigger, unbeaten light heavyweight champion in his prime is the path of least resistance?
So then what do you call Jermall Charlo turning down Demetrius Andrade to fight the likes of Brandon Adams, Juan Macias Montiel, and look at the guy he's fighting now, Maciej Suliecki, a guy Demetrius Andrade beat 2 years ago.
What do you call that?
What do you call Team Benavidez turning down a David Morrell fight to fight the likes of David Lemieux?
What do you call that?
What do you call Errol Spence Jr. willfully unifying with Yordenis Ugas ahead of Terence Crawford, instead of Terence Crawford?
This was all about shading Canelo and Matchroom.
If you don't believe me, get a whiff of what Tom Brown Brown said, "Fortunately now for Matchroom and DAZN, they'll be able to ride our coattails from our last show with Canelo, which was not on an app. That show had the promotional muscle of both the PBC and Showtime behind it, because remember, prior to our show, Canelo was kind of off of the public's radar for 6 fights in a row on the app."
Off the public's radar, before he fought your guy Caleb Plant, he broke the indoor attendance record with Billy Joe Saunders.
On the app, if anybody's riding anybody's coattails here, you're riding theirs.
That fight didn't do what it did because of PBC or Showtime. It did what it did because of Canelo.
Tom Brown added, "We brought an American world champion to him and put our promotional muscle behind it. And look, we did 800,000 buys in today's world. We also had
16,500 people at the MGM Grand.
And we did an $18 million gate. Remember, he had 70,000 plus in Arlington, and he did a $9 million gate. The attendance for Alvarez's stoppage of England's Billy Joe Saunders drew an announced crowd of 73,126 people to the Dallas Cowboys AT&T Stadium.
AT&T Stadium.
Wait a minute. If Tom Brown's argument is that Canelo Alvarez was off the grid, off the radar, fighting on an app, then why did more people know about his fight with Billy Joe Saunders?
You can't fill an arena with 70,000 people when you're off the grid.
That doesn't make any sense. Tom Brown added, "Errol Spence is that next guy in boxing," Brown said. "He's already a pay-per-view star. He's doing legitimate gates. And look, he has shown his mettle. He was willing to move up more than 2 divisions to fight Canelo, to bolster his legacy. It does show how special he really is and what a true champion he is." Yeah, and Canelo's moving up to light heavyweight to take on Dimitri Bivol, where it seems your plan for Spence was to cash him out against Canelo the same way Mikey Garcia was cashed out against Spence. A glorified loss.
In layman's terms, you thought it would be more lucrative to have him lose to Canelo than put any effort into making the Crawford fight.
Because he was never going to beat Canelo, so let's can that crap right away.
These guys are still sulking after all this time.
You know why that is? It's because Canelo Alvarez effectively hit it and quit it.
That fight with Caleb Plant was tantamount to a one-night stand.
If it was anything, it was that. Neither Jermall Charlo or David Benavidez or Errol Spence Jr. have anything that Canelo Alvarez wants, and he's not strapped for cash. Wherever this guy goes, the money and the audience follows.
Errol Spence is the next guy.
The next guy? Errol Spence Jr. is a year older than Canelo Alvarez. He's 32 to Canelo, who's 31, and he's nowhere near as accomplished as Canelo as a boxer. He doesn't generate anywhere near as much revenue. What do you mean, the next guy? Errol's a year older than Canelo. Jermall Charlo, he's the same age. Same applies to him. Nowhere near as accomplished. Doesn't generate anywhere near as much revenue.
That's why Tom Brown is sulking.
Canelo had a one-night stand with the PBC. He hit it and quit it. He got what he wanted, then he left.
There's fuck all you can do about it.
That's why Tom Brown is still sulking. Tom Brown, who equates the success of Canelo versus Plant as a pay-per-view to the PBC and Showtime's promotional muscle. But if that's all it takes, the PBC's promotional muscle and Showtime's, how come Gervonta Davis don't do numbers like Canelo? Is his fight with Rolly Romero, is that going to do 800,000 buys? And what about Spence versus Ugas? The reported buy rate for that fight was
240,000-ish.
Don't those guys got the PBC and Showtime's promotional engine behind them?
Why aren't they doing the kind of numbers Canelo's doing?
What's the problem? I'll tell you what the problem is. The problem is you keep trying to convince people that these fighters are better than they actually are, and people aren't buying it. Quite literally. They're not buying it. They're not buying these pay-per-views and buying these fights or attending them anywhere as near as much as they're attending Canelo's fights and buying Canelo's fights. You can't fool them.
Doesn't work.
What you're doing now is you're sulking because Canelo Alvarez had a one-night stand with you. One-night stand with the PBC. He hit it and quit it and got what he wanted, whereas what you wanted was more of a commitment. You wanted him to stick around. You wanted more of a relationship.
They're not wifey material.
Does that hurt your feelings? That the PBC and Showtime's promotional engine can't get those guys?
Spence is a little older than Canelo. Nowhere near as accomplished. Nowhere near as popular.
He's not.
He's not as good a fighter as Canelo Alvarez. That's the truth. Neither is Jermall Charlo. Not even close. He's the same age as Canelo Alvarez, and look at his quality of competition. Look at how he's doing.
Look.
How he does in the ring. How he's doing at the box office.
Look.
You can't really forge a Mexican superstar of your own in David Benavidez because your guy Jermall Charlo keeps finding reasons not to fight him. So you're having no success on that front.
And it's hard to make David a superstar while he's turning down fights with David Morrell.
You're failing! is what you're doing.
Failing.
You're failing! You want people to believe that Canelo Alvarez, facing an unbeaten light heavyweight champion in his prime, who's a naturally bigger man than David Benavidez, naturally bigger than Jermall Charlo, naturally bigger than Errol Spence Jr. You want people to believe that fighting him is somehow the path of least resistance, and people just aren't going to buy it.
Your fighters are the ones on the path of least resistance, and everybody knows it.
That's why there's a cap on how much success they've had and are having thus far, because they're the ones on the path of least resistance, and people aren't stupid. The only ones opting for Tom Brown's...
Only tribalists and xenophobes opt for this mentality.
Jermall and Errol are these special fucking snowflakes. These special fucking fighters based solely on where they're from and what they look like. It's only a small group, a small contingent that actually adheres to and abides by this hierarchy of thought, if you even want to call it that.
Because they're not thinking straight.
Errol Spence Jr. is cannon fodder to the likes of Canelo Alvarez. You heard what I said. Cannon fodder. And so is Jermall Charlo, even though he's naturally bigger than Errol Spence Jr.
Look, Tom Brown says Canelo could have fought a middleweight champion.
If he makes it past Dimitri, he's about to fight one in Gennady Golovkin, a more decorated, more well-known, more international world champion than Jermall Charlo, who's a small-time local guy.
Canelo versus Golovkin 3 does better business than Canelo versus Charlo. It's not even close.
But don't try to poo-poo all over Gennady Golovkin as an opponent when you fucking wish Gennady would give one of your guys a time of day. Case in point, you've got David Benavidez fighting a guy that Gennady Golovkin starched in one-sided fashion 6 or 7 years ago.
That's the best you could do.
While you're prattling on about the PBC and Showtime's promotional engine, that's the best you could conjure up for your guy, David Benavidez, a guy that Gennady Golovkin slapped around in late 2015.
This is embarrassing.
Stupid. Fucking stupid is what it is. You want guys like me, the consumer, to view a naturally bigger, unbeaten light heavyweight champion in his prime as the path of least resistance, and...
What's that make Errol? What's that make Jermall?
Canelo Alvarez, those guys would be the path of least resistance. They themselves have been on the path of least resistance for some time now, as well as David Benavidez, who's not fighting David Morrell, an interesting, challenging, unbeaten fighter in his division. No, he's fighting a very past-it middleweight.
The second tier, second-string guys ain't stars, sweetheart.
Sounded more and more like a jilted ex. Canelo hit it and quit it. You wanted more of a commitment.
Fuck off.
Call you an Uber.